Hello everyone, and today we're going to talk about how to beat Brawl with Poke. So, has this ever been your team? You decide to play a Poke comp such as Double Shield, Ball Sigma plus Ash or something. Like, it's a good map, long sight lines, wide angles, and we decide it's good to play a Poke comp. But the enemy decides to go Brawl. They decide to go Rhine, Diva, like McCree, even though the map is has really long sight lines, and they're pretty much one trick Brawl Andes even maybe. But you still get rolled. You still get rolled despite the map being good for poke, and then you panic switch to Brawl like always. Has this ever been you? If so, you can change that. So the slogan today that I want to talk about is Poke, Brawl, Snowball. And that slogan describes how you want to play poke comps against brawl comps. So, regardless of the type of poke comp you're playing, doing these three things will buy you success against poke comps. So, first, you want to be poking from a safe distance. And you want to use multiple angles on the enemy, and you want to go for actual targets. You don't want to shoot the Rhine shield. You want to shoot squishies, shoot the tanks themselves, and force out those resources. And then once you've softened up the enemy enough, once you've forced out cooldowns or have ultimates, then you can start brawling. You can start using your tank to push in, and then your DPS can go in. Your supports can look for like cooldowns, like Alnade, for example, and then you can win the fight by just going in once the enemy is softened up by your poke damage. But afterwards, you won the fight. What do you do now? You don't just sit there and celebrate you winning the fight. Sure, you can briefly do it, but you have to look to snowball the enemy. You have to look to set up positions ahead of the objective and use opening ults to preempt the enemy's game plan. So let me go over these points more in detail. So Brawl has a lot of sustain, and sustain basically means it can hold a position, which is usually the point, cart, or whatever for a long time. But in exchange for that, it lacks range damage, and it's incredibly dependent on its resources, such as cooldowns, shields, defense matrix, ultimates to an extent. And because Brawl has to play like stacked together, it also gives up a lot of map control, which means that you can use a lot of areas of the map. You can use high grounds, you can use weird off angles, you can use it to try to poke out the Brawl more effectively. And you have to realize those are really big weaknesses, and that's a reason why Brawl isn't that popular in top level play, because these are huge weaknesses that pro players know how to exploit. But even you can take advantage of that, even though you might not you might not be a pro player, but still, like, these are weaknesses that you can absolutely take advantage of. Brawl might be an easier comp to play than most other comps, but still, you can still win with poke comps. You just have to know how, and taking advantage of these weaknesses is how you beat brawl comps with poke. So, when you don't have control of the objective at this stage, you look to position at a safe distance, not right next to Rhine, first of all, and second, on long sight lines, because poke is all about those long sight lines. And you want to look to split as much as possible. Split your DPS, split your tanks. You don't want to play your tanks stacked together usually. And you might even split your support, so you might have your Zen take off angles to try to get more poke, if you have a Zen, for example. But you just want to like split as much as possible. And the other reason you want to do that is Brawl will often look to try to rush one of your players down. And if you just stack together, then that just gives something for them to swing at. So you don't want to do that. They want to like rush one of your players, then make sure they can only get one at most. You don't want them to be able to trade more than one or two of your players in exchange for using their cooldowns and resources. If they rush one of you, it better be limited to only one casualty or two at most. So you just want to play split as possible. You don't want to be stacked. Brawl wants you to be corralled together, but Poke, you want to be split. You want to find those opportunities to force out cooldowns, aim at squishies, force players to 1 HP or even kill them. That's good. And finally, you want to aim for squishies if possible. It is okay to shoot Ryan or his off tank if they're an easy target, But bursting down squishy targets forces out resources faster, like cooldowns. Like your bat, like their bat would have to use im more, for example, if they want to save maybe a Kree that's at 1 HP. So shooting squishies will get more value a lot of the time, at least. Even though like sometimes it is good to shoot Rhino Diva, especially if they're being trying to aggress. So if the enemy decides to say rush one of your teammates, you must peel for them by intensifying the pressure on the enemy as that happens. And that would involve your DPS taking more aggressive angles or going in closer. Your tanks using cooldowns, like your off tank, for example, or even your Ball, Winston, or Orisa just like pressing W into the enemy. And don't be afraid to use cooldowns or even ultimates if you have to. Brawl is incredibly dependent on cooldowns, but you are not. It's better to use cooldowns than it is to lose a player during the poke phase where you are the strongest. And during the poke phase, your main threat will really be any enemy range DPS or even the off tank that will try to split apart from their team to find an angle on one of your teammates. If that happens, you must force them back to their team ASAP. So you want to prioritize shooting any target that's looking for a weird angle to try to eliminate one of your players. So for example, in this picture, the Kree is looking for an angle on the Zen. So your Ball is just gonna try to force him back to his team. And remember, Brawl doesn't really have range heals. Otherwise, they have to run something like Mercy or Brig, which means that they lose Lucio. And running Brawl without Lucio is obviously a no-go most of the time. So you want to exploit that. If anyone tries to split, you force them back to your team. You force them to stick together. And dive tanks or dive heroes like Ball and Tracer are really helpful in this because they're really good at punishing enemies that are split. And dive tanks can also create windows where you can rotate through open space without being poked out by their off tank or ranged DPS. So your ball can kind of roll through or slam, creating space for your Hanzo or Echo to just get behind them. And that's how you usually like open the fight. So you might have your ball take some attention so that your DPS can get into positions. So Brawl wants to hold the objective as long as possible, so that even if it loses, it has either drained the clock or achieved a lot of capture percentage. But even though you are a poke comp, at a certain point, and this is like the title, but at a certain point, you can actually start brawling with the enemy, even though like they are running Brawl. So, and the thing is, once Brawl starts losing its resources and players, it becomes much weaker at actually brawling. Like if their Ryan uses a lot of shield, then he doesn't want to swing. He's gonna look for cover and he's gonna look to just play really passively. And you can exploit that. You can actually start brawling, especially if you have like especially if you're like really your main tank is still alive. So if you're running something like Ball or Winston, especially, that can easily go in and try to like force a lot of attention and create opportunities for your team to just go in. And when you're looking to brawl, like the key resources you're looking for are in order of importance. Immortality Field, first of all, because it's a really powerful cooldown, but it's a 25-second cooldown. And a wasted field might be enough for you to go in. And another critical resource is Diva Defense Matrix because it's really valuable for absorbing spam and peeling. But once that is gone, then they are like going to be much more vulnerable, especially if you're running something like if you have something like a Tracer or like if you're running like a dive hero that does close range damage, then Diva Defense Matrix is a key like resource. Rhine Shield, and to a lesser extent Sigma or Orisa Shield if they're running something like Rhine Sigma or Rhine Orisa, and followed by CC cooldowns like Flashbang and Hack. But it's only really important if you're running something like Winston or Ball or like another example might be something like Tracer or Doomfist if you're running Doomfist, which can find its place in a poke comp because Doomfist can look to go in, go out to fish for picks. And the finally you're gonna look for self-sustain and escape cooldowns like Ice Block and Combat Roll. And if you see like those cooldowns being used, then you can make those your main targets. So you can go for May if she used Ice Block, or you can go for Kree if he's used Combat Roll. And Immor is also another example, but Immor's at the top because Immor benefits the whole team. And you can also go in and brawl if you have ultimates, especially self-sustain or burst damage ultimates, like Nano, Rally, Flux, and Barrage. And also, if you get picks on targets during the poke phase, you can like consider brawling, but every pick is different. So if you kill the enemy Rhine, then that allows your main tank to go in without being punished as much. So you want to recharge your cooldowns, especially your main tank cooldowns before brawling in. You can if you kill off tanks or DPS, then you can take even more aggressive angles first. You actually don't want to you actually don't want to like immediately start brawling if you don't have those angles, because if you kill an off tank or DPS, that like mostly means that like they can't really contest your angles as much. So you actually want to say, hey, I killed the Kree and Diva, so I'm going to actually send my Echo behind them before I start brawling him, and then I'm just gonna go from multiple angles. So let's talk about support. So if you kill Lucio, then losing Lucio is like more of a long-term thing. In the short term, they can look to use ultimates to try to like stabilize or win or stall time, but you probably can't brawl immediately. But since they don't have Lucio, it means that they can't really rush any of you anymore. So you can start to edge in closer and do more damage, and you can poke from closer distances, which will increase your amount of poke damage. And if you kill the flex support, I'm talking Bap, Moira, Ana, like you won't run Zen usually in Brawl. You could win without brawling. It's all damage that you do is now lethal damage. So you want to focus on forcing out cooldowns, because they will have to use cooldowns instead of getting healed, because all damage is now lethal damage because they don't have a flex support. So you want to force those resources out before entering like the brawling phase. And when it's time to brawl, then you're gonna initiate like basically your main tank's gonna go in. The rest of your team wants to use their cooldowns all at once in a decisive synchronized engagement. And so like you're gonna have your Hanzo use like Storm Arrow. You're gonna have your Echo use stickies. You're gonna have your Sigma just use rock, for example. You're just gonna throw all your cooldowns at them. And long range heroes can close the distance a bit, but heroes with good close range damage should go close and personal. Like if you're running something like Diva or even Echo to an extent, then you can like try to like just go in and brawl, and your main tank's gonna help protect them in that case. And let's say you won the fight. It's great. Now what? So briefly celebrate your victory, sure, but you want to look to snowball the enemy. You don't want to like go through that ordeal. The first fight in any like poke versus brawl will be one of the hardest fights. And regardless of whether you're on attack or defense, you want to take positions ahead of the objective on long sight lines and multiple angles, and see whether you can use opening ults to win the fight easily. And the key point is Brawl wants to force the objective, but you want to make them bleed if they try to do that. So you can scout the enemy, see where they're coming from, so you can set up your angles beforehand as early as possible and as cleanly as possible. You want to do damage to the enemy as early as you can ahead of the objective. And you're playing poke, so like you can absolutely try to start doing damage ahead of the objective. You want an early poke phase. You don't want to allow them to just go onto cart without taking any poke. And don't be afraid, like, even if you're, like, 3v6ing, like, they're Brawl, like, they can't do anything if they're in long range, so at most it's gonna be, like, a 3v1 or 3v2. Like, it's you, like, Echo, Hanzo, Mercy versus, let's say, Kree and Diva. The rest can't really do that much. Bap can kind of poke, but in general, like, Brawl heroes are really weak at poking, and you don't want to hug the point. That's the key point as well. And you want to use ults to win the fight easily if possible, especially ults that allow you to sustain yourself, or like for example Nano, or burst damage ults such as Flux. And you want to make sure that you maintain a safe distance from the enemy unless you can use ults to win. Note that the more mobile the hero is, the closer you can like be to the enemy because you can escape. So you want your Hanzo, who can't really escape that well on long range. You want your Zen maybe on cart, for example. But heroes like Ball, Echo, they can like try to get a bit close. And if the enemy uses cooldowns or ultimates to try to make space and try to break your kill box, then you have to kite to maintain long sight lines, unless you're gonna like use ultimates. But you should be using ultimates early anyways, before the enemy can use those cooldowns or ultimates to try to make space. And you want to set up positions around the objective. And if you have mobile heroes, you want to stall the objective as much as possible. And because like since you should have done like some initial poke already, then you can like have like Ball, for example, get close and try to stall because you already softened up the enemy a bit. And Brawl teams will often try to clear the high ground, but once they're on the objective, they have to give it up, basically. They can only like put one or two on the high ground. They can't necessarily put like Ryan on the high ground forever. So when that happens, you retake and you try to use the high ground. So let's say they try to push in onto cart and they drop from gas station like roof. So your ball's gonna look to retake the high ground, your echo's gonna look to retake the high ground, then you're gonna look to engage from there. And your Sigma's gonna kite, and then like afterwards he's gonna go aggressive once they have softened up the enemy. And this is like especially if they're forcing Brawl on bad maps like Gibraltar, what else? Numbani, for example, and yeah, Numbani first in particular. And finally, part of an effective snowball is the good cycling of ultimates. So you want to see what ultimates or ultimate combos on your team can win fights quickly, such as Nano into Primal slash Copy, which is like a pretty good ult combo and can actually win fights by itself. And for example, another example is EMP, which is extremely powerful. And those are what I like to call key ultimates. And you want to aim to only use one key ultimate or ultimate combo per fight if possible. So EMP one fight, you nano another fight, and you keep cycling. You keep cycling until you have to break the cycle. But if you're doing it properly, then you should be able to maintain a cycle for at least like one or two times. And Brawl has weak ultimates, especially outside of the mirror, and since Brawl is so resource dependent, the earlier you use an ultimate and you force out the enemy's resources, the more you cripple the enemy's ability to respond. And so that's like one of the key parts. But yeah, in the next episode we're gonna go over some examples and of like how to like deal against Brawl's poke. And yeah, I hope that was informative.